Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome, literally very warm welcome to today's session, today's talk, and the Adda, the conversation with Professor Partha Chatterjee. Speaking on, is Kolkata a colonial city? And then in conversation with Professor Kaushik Bhaumik, Professor Madhuja Mukherjee, and Professor Ashish Rajadhaksha. And it's a great pleasure and privilege for the Victoria Memorial Hall to co-host this event with the Department of Film Studies in Jadavpur University, the Lingnan University in Hong Kong, and the Center for the Study of Culture and Society in Bangalore. As a matter of fact, this is a public lecture which is occasioned by the ongoing Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Summer School 2018, which is going on at this moment in the Department of Film Studies, Jadavpur University. And I would like to invite the distinguished speaker, Professor Partha Chatterjee, along with his would-be interlocutors, Professor Ashish Rajadhaksha, Professor Kaushik Bhaumik, and Professor Madhuja Mukherjee, to please come up and take their seats on the dais. And before we start this evening's proceedings, it's my honor to present the distinguished speakers with a small souvenir from the Victoria Memorial Hall. Tonight's session is being aptly chaired by Lord Cornwallis, who is just standing guard. I will not say anything about the distinguished speakers to this audience. Everybody, we have very stellar luminaries on the dais with us. Professor Partha Chatterjee is a star. I would not venture into introducing him or any of the other panelists. So, without further ado, I would request Professor Madhuja Mukherjee of the Department of Film Studies, Jadavpur University, and my co-host for the lecture tonight to come up and say something about tonight's session. Professor Madhuja Mukherjee. Thank you very much. Please enjoy the talk and the conversations after it. Professor Madhuja.
I wish to begin by thanking Victoria Memorial Hall for kindly hosting this talk, which is part of our Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Summer School, currently being held at Jadavpur University. I just wanted to thank everybody for being here and request Ashish Rajadhaksha to chair the session.
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much to the organizers. And even as I speak, I hear my voice echo. And I can also hear the muffled drums of the Imperial Enterprise as we sit here. It is going to be an occasion to actually have Partha Chatterjee and all of us sitting at the foot of Lord Cornwallis. And you must remember the metaphor of the black hole of empire as we do that. It is also going to be my extraordinary privilege to introduce Partha Chatterjee to Calcutta audiences, which is a feat that I think most people would not have ventured, but since I'm outside here, I can go where angels fear to tread. And I can also take the excuse that some of the audience, many of the audience who are sitting here, actually are from the Inter-Asia Studies Collective. And while they may not know that much about Calcutta, and while they may know something about India, while they may have some idea about what Indian history was, and while they may have some sense of what British colonialism was, they all know their Partha Chatterjee. This much, I think, is clear. So it's actually more a sense of reintroducing than introducing Partha Chatterjee. Chatterjee's work over the years and decades primarily has been associated with the Subaltern Studies Collective, something, again, that's extremely well known. But his own writing, starting from the derivative discourse, going on to The Nation and its Fragments, and then a series of further books, including compilations, more recently The Politics of the Governed, and still more recently The Black Hole of Empire, are texts that have been, as we all know, translated in Chinese. If I'm not mistaken, Partho, the Chinese translator of your work is going to be joining us in the summer school soon. So he's going to be here as well. So there will be other views. Chatterjee, while he has been read and while there are a series of concepts that are associated with Chatterjee, everybody knows the concept of political society and civil society, terms which are associated with and linked with various terms in Asia, Asian contexts, the idea of the home and the world, the ideas of homogeneous and heterogeneous time, and all of these concepts which are actually now the milk and honey, if you like, of cultural studies disciplines. It is also the case that many of these concepts have traveled in a way that has sometimes almost been free associative or de-linked from where they may have originally come from. And it is extremely interesting and a real privilege for me then to bring these concepts back via the man himself, first of all, and bring them back to Calcutta and eventually to the venue, if I'm not mistaken, of his choice, the Victoria Memorial, where we are going to be discussing these. So without further ado, I invite Partha Chatterjee himself to come and speak to us. He has agreed to speak for approximately 30 minutes, at the end of which we'll be in conversation with him, Madhuja Mukherjee, Kaushik Bhaumik, and myself. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I must begin by thanking all the organizers of the summer school that's now going on in Jadavpur. It's a rather complex organization, and I'm not going to mention all the different names of people. And also the director, Jayanta Sengupta of the Victoria Memorial, for organizing this. This has turned out to be a rather appropriate place for asking the question that I'm going to ask: is Calcutta a colonial city? Setting itself is rather odd, if I may say so. But it's a slightly difficult task that I have before me, because there are two very distinct groups of people in this audience. There's first the students who are the participants in the summer school, many of whom have arrived in the city only last night and know almost nothing about the city. And there are others, several faces that I recognize here, of people who have lived in this city for even longer than I have. So I am a little undecided as to where I should pitch this talk. But I think it would be best for me to actually address the summer school participants specifically, and because we will have time afterwards when I'll be in conversation with Ashish, Kaushik, and Madhuja, when maybe we can have a more informed discussion among people who actually have a much more intimate knowledge of the history and the present scene in the city than many of the participants who've just arrived. So let me first begin by just recalling that this particular place where we are today was, in fact, a memorial to Queen Victoria. It was conceived of by Lord Curzon, who was then the Viceroy and Governor General of India. It was, the foundation stone was laid in 1906 when Curzon was still governor. He was about to leave at that point of time. And it was completed in 1922. The funds were raised through contributions from Indians. This is, in fact, characteristic of most colonial monuments in practically every colonial city. It's the local populations which paid for all of these grand monuments. So we should remember that. I won't go into the architectural design and so on, the mixture of the Oriental as well with the European and so on and so forth. People have written about it. There are actually statues of obviously Queen Victoria herself and King Edward VII, I think, on the southern gate, an equestrian statue, right? And Curzon himself is at 2 or 3 places in this building. So the statue of Curzon, which was outside on the entrance to the main gate, that's been replaced, and I think that is particularly significant in terms of the transformation of the colonial city. It was replaced by a statue of Aurobindo Ghosh in the state when he was Sri Aurobindo, which is a different phase in his life. Aurobindo Ghosh, who was initially a revolutionary leader, and then gave up politics and took up became a spiritual leader. That, of course, is emblematic of the transformation of many of the landmark monuments to British viceroys, governors, generals, who used to line the streets and squares of the city all around this area. When I was growing up in the 1950s, they were all there. They began to be removed from the 1960s onwards, and all of those were replaced by statues of nationalist leaders. Around this area, this entire area, which is the open area called the Maidan, was actually the grounds of the fort, which is directly to the west of this monument, all along the river. That fort, Fort William, is still an active military establishment in the heart of the city. And that was, in fact, that's actually a new fort. The old fort used to be further north, which later became Dalhousie Square, the main administrative and business center of colonial Calcutta. There's a whole history to why that old fort was abandoned and this new fort built. Incidentally, this entire area until the middle of the 18th century was a very well-settled village called Govindapur. That entire village was cleared. That was the first major rehabilitation and resettlement program in the city. The whole area from the racecourse down there all the way up to Esplanade, that entire area, which is now the Maidan, and the fort itself, was cleared. Many of the wealthier Indian residents of that city were given compensation. And many of them moved, as we know, for instance, some of the famous magnates and wealthy families of the city moved. Some moved further up north. Most of them moved further up north. One or two, like the Ghoshals, for instance, moved south into the Khidirpur area. The poor, most of the markets, it was a flourishing village. The markets moved to what is now called Chetla. That's where they moved, and this entire area was cleared out. It is still the property of the Defense Department, the army. this entire area. So I will come to some of the continuities with the colonial period, and this is one, which is the fact that the fort still continues to be a fort, and all of this area continues to be property of the military, essentially. Dalhousie Square, which is further up north, all along the riverfront, Dalhousie Square was both the administrative center. It was the administrative center for the entire, all of British India until 1911, when the capital was shifted from Delhi, from Calcutta to Delhi. But Dalhousie Square was also the business center. Most of the British commercial houses in the city, both banks and the various mercantile houses, were in that area. The riverfront, all of the riverfront, all the way down to what is still called the docks further south, was an active, very active port well into the 1950s. That's another part of colonial Calcutta that has completely transformed, because the docks are practically not used anymore. It's a very, very minor use of the dock. All of the riverfront now is basically a promenade. It is no longer really used. I mean, no ocean-going vessels actually come up the river anymore. Again, this was not true. Even in the 1950s, I remember ocean-going ships would actually come all the way up. The city itself, this area, which is the central part, going further east onto Park Street, Chowrangi, that area, was called White Town. It's interesting to note that there was no formal segregation in colonial Calcutta. There was no formal laws of segregation which kept populations apart. But informally, there was very much a segregation in terms of residential patterns, in terms of who were allowed to walk about the town. The police would stop people and ask what they were doing, why they were there. There were all kinds of vagrancy rules and so on. Much of the property in White Town was actually owned by Indians, but let out only to European tenants. What was called Black Town was largely further up north. Black Town consisted of a wide variety of classes of people. There were extremely wealthy Indians, magnates with huge mansions. Some of them are still there, you could see them. But they were surrounded by a service population, mostly in shacks, shanties, slums. And that was the nature. It was very overcrowded. And part of the colonial planning in the 19th century was to basically, the way Paris was opened up in Haussmann's architecture, broad avenues cutting right through Blacktown. So Amherst Street, the last one was Central Avenue, Cornwallis Street, College Street. All of these were opened up straight, going all the way up north. It was largely also to facilitate the movement of the police and the troops, in case this was particularly after 1857, after the Great Revolt, when there was the possibility of some kind of urban uprising, and there was the question of whether or not troops would be able to go into these areas. So these were all, both security, combined with questions of public health, etc., they combined to produce this sort of design of town planning. There was a kind of intermediate zone in between, which was a mixed zone ethnically. Calcutta was, you might say, a typical place of what one could call colonial cosmopolitanism. It was cosmopolitan because there were really people of many ethnic groups. There was a large Chinese population. There was a small but extremely wealthy Armenian population. Again, a small but particularly distinctive Jewish population. There were Greek merchants. There were people from Southeast Asia. One of the earliest detailed travelogues of the city, written early 19th century, was by a traveling merchant from Penang. And there was the Burma connection. People from Burma who studied in Calcutta, who had professions in Calcutta, and who had businesses in Calcutta. Well into 1959, that's when they left mostly. So, if we want to look at sort of public life, early 19th century, you actually have fairly vibrant public life, the new public life, a kind of civic life emerging in the city through literary societies, various debating societies, associations of different kinds, including collaborations among European and Indian merchants, which were ethnically mixed, Europeans and Indians. 1850s onwards, this begins to change. Perhaps once again, it's the Revolt of 1857, which is probably the dividing line. After the 1860s, you have essentially two very different publics, and that is a completely segregated public. There is a kind of white society, which is restricted to the clubs, the European clubs were mostly, all of the major clubs in this area and the further south were all white clubs. There were no Indian members. There were, again, societies, associations, and so on, which were strictly European. And then, north of the city, in so-called Blacktown, you get the emergence of an Indian public, various associations, literary societies, political associations, and the political associations which ultimately take the form of the Indian National Congress, emerge in the north of the city. Political meetings are held in halls, theaters, auditoriums, and so on. There's a new stage which opens up in north of the city, completely Indian. There is a European stage as well in this part of town, segregated once again. What political associations in the north, of course, they take the form of anti-colonial nationalist movements from the 1870s, 80s onwards. By the 20th century, these get more and more powerful. An important point of transition was the taking over by Indians of the city municipal corporation, the municipal body that runs the city. 1923 is when the Congress essentially takes over the corporation. And of course, that's one of the first major public institutions in the city which gets taken over by Indians. This process obviously continues into the 1930s. There are political agitations and so on. An interesting thing that a lot of people who are used to seeing political demonstrations and large, massive meetings in this part of the city, in the Maidan, often do not realize is this is entirely a post-independence phenomenon. Before independence, there were no political meetings allowed in this area. It was simply not possible. All of the meetings, even the large meetings, would have been held in parks and squares in other parts of the town, mostly in the north, not here. Once again, this changes from the 1950s onwards. This changes because the entire Maidan, which was then very largely until then, as I said, largely reserved for drills and parades of the army and sort of leisure grounds for Europeans, the racecourse, for instance. This changes completely. It is taken over by, you might say, a much more democratic public. After the 1950s, the Maidan becomes a major center, one, of sporting activities and of politics. Major mass demonstrations and meetings are held here. The grounds just north and south of this place. In terms of major events, let me just move very quickly into what happens, the transitions, and then why. Ask the question then, is it possible to call Calcutta a colonial city any longer? In terms of the changes, the 1940s are a major transition. At least two events are particularly significant. One is the famine of 1943, again, a feature of a colonial economy in which the entire question of food, particularly food grains, the supply and stocking of food grains, which was completely disrupted because of the demand that food grains be procured by government in order to supply the army and the city of Calcutta. And so this led very large to a completely artificially created shortage. And of course, lots of people have researched this subject in recent times, why the famine occurred in 1943. It's one of the most disastrous famines of modern history anywhere in the world. And of course, the city was the place where hungry people from the districts actually crowded in and died here. And there was the first really major riots between Hindus and Muslims, 1946. Once again in this city, a prelude to the partition of 1947. Let me move quickly into what happens after independence and what changes. After independence, of course, there is a huge administrative change. In terms of the British presence, the presence dwindles. Of course, the first big change is the departure of British governors and senior British officials who leave fairly quickly. The British presence of British business houses continues into the 1950s and early 60s. It begins to dwindle. By the mid-1960s, most of them have left. So many of those companies still continued, but under Indian ownership. Wealthy Indians began to move into White Town, into the various European clubs, which no longer remain all white. That is another very major part of the change that takes place. There is, of course, a huge influx of people into the city, which largely follows the partition. These are the refugees mainly from East Pakistan who move in, who settle in squatter settlements called colonies on the outskirts of the city. It completely transforms the demography of the city. That is a very major. It changes, I think, over the length of the 50s, 60s, 70s. It changes the cultural complexion of the city. It changes the political complexion of the city. The implications of this demographic transformation, I think, is still not understood completely. But it's a very, very significant change that takes place. It's very interesting to ask the question how this very large influx how these people were actually domesticated into the fabric of Calcutta and West Bengal society. If you think of other comparable situations, if you think of Karachi, if you think of the Palestinians in Jordan or Lebanon, and the enormous conflicts that were produced there, nothing remotely comparable happened here. And it's a very interesting question to ask how that was possible. Now, this expansion of the city through the 60s, 70s, and it's still continuing, I think, as many of you will notice now, coming into the city from the airport, for instance, the main axis of the city, which was always north-south, just east of this area, north-south, that was the main axis of the city. It's moved much further east. You might now say that the axis has really moved because what is now called Salt Lake has become another parallel settlement, a very important settlement, and all along the east you have new settlements which have now emerged all the way south. And it's a completely different axis now. Two things have happened to this center of the city, which I think were sort of almost the last blow. One is the dwindling and ultimately, you might say, the death of the port of Calcutta. That is gone, which was a very, very major support for the colonial character of Calcutta. And the other thing that's happened is that the main administrative building, which was the heart of the administration of all of British India, the Writers' Building, has been vacated. Nothing happens there. It's supposed to be under renovation. Nobody knows whether the government will ever return there. So as a result, Dalhousie Square is no longer, I think, possibly terminally, it is no longer the center of the city. I think that is in some ways emblematic of the end of the colonial regime or of colonial history. So as far as the structural conditions are concerned, my answer to my question is Calcutta is no longer a colonial city, has not been for quite some time. But is it still colonial in spirit? I think that's a question which I will leave for discussion because many of you will probably be interested in pursuing that question. I think there's one very interesting development here, which is new, which is the concern with heritage. The concern with heritage is, of course, preservation of the memory of colonial times, in architecture, in the preservation of neighborhoods, in the preservation of documents. Victoria Memorial functions as a very major center of this sort of heritage preservation. it is likely or it is supposed to be an attraction for tourists if Dalhousie Square or many of these places are returned in a sense to a certain kind of physical form of what they were like in colonial times. There have been little revivals of this kind in the small settlements like the Danish settlement in Sirampur or the French settlement in Chandanagar across the river. There have been proposals that Dalhousie Square be renovated and returned to some kind of colonial form once more. It would be a tourist attraction. So, well then, it's colonial history in that kind of touristy form that, it may still be preserved. Otherwise, if you think of the spirit of the colonial in a sort of its presence, especially among us English-speaking classes of the city, my sense is that the ambition is actually to move out of Calcutta. So if that is the case, then I don't see where that as far as the spirit is concerned, I'm not sure that colonial Calcutta has much attraction anymore. So I'll leave this at that, and maybe there will be some debate over this. Thank you.
Just evoking a friend of ours who ought to have been here and isn't here, Kwan Ching Chen. One of the ways by which you might be able to approach this, I think continuing from Partho's presentation just now, is maybe the idea of looking at Calcutta as method. What actually constitutes, if you like, the methodological approaches and challenges that a place like Calcutta can open up. And part of the reason we're doing it like this in relation to Partho's sort of presentation both now and I think his work over the years, where he has hugely used material from Calcutta and from Bengal to theorize on, to use his phrase, most of the world, to make large arguments around political questions, for example, around questions of power, for example, as these apply to questions of colonialism across large parts of the globe, leads one to ask the question as to what is there about Calcutta that has allowed him to theorize on such a grand canvas what he has seen, what he has talked about here. It has given us an opportunity to have Partho return us to Calcutta, the Calcutta that has been his theoretical stamping ground. And it has also allowed us, I think, to open up the larger kinds of, the fragments, again to use a Chatterjee phrase, the fragments that we have put together in order to be able to assemble our understanding of the experienced and the lived sort of definitions of modernity. I want to, I remember Dipesh Chakravarti's phrase on defining an adda as long, intense and unstructured conversations. Now, I don't know how structured or unstructured this is going to be, but I'm now inviting Kaushik Bhaumik to make the opening gambit. He'll take a few minutes to make a series of presentations as he thinks best.